March 10, 1945. The cold wind coming off New York Harbor cut through the morning air like a knife. Gray clouds hung low above the water. A transport ship slowly approached the pier, its steel hull groaning as it moved through the harbor. Along the docks, American soldiers waited silently. Some carried clipboards. Others stood with rifles slung over their shoulders. None of them looked particularly nervous. But aboard the ship, fear was everywhere. 48 German women stood crowded together near the railing. Their faces were pale. Their uniforms were worn thin after months of hardship. Many hadn't seen a proper bed in over a year. Some hadn't enjoyed a hot meal in months. And every one of them believed the same thing. Their nightmare was only beginning. For 18 long months they had been prisoners of war, captured as Germany's military machine slowly collapsed across Europe. During those months they had heard countless stories. Stories about the Americans. Stories about revenge. Stories about humiliation. Stories about what happened to prisoners after capture. No one knew which stories were true. But fear has a way of making every rumor feel real. Especially during war. The women stared at the shoreline as the ship moved closer. America. The nation they had been taught to hate. The nation now holding their fate in its hands. Some prayed quietly. Others remained silent. A few simply stared at the water, trying not to think about what waited ahead. The smell aboard the ship was overwhelming. Saltwater mixed with sweat. Wet clothing. Unwashed bodies. Fear. Many of the women had not been able to bathe properly for months. Their hair was tangled. Their uniforms carried the stains of endless travel. And beneath their collars, beneath their sleeves, beneath almost every layer of clothing, lies thousands of them. An invisible army that had followed them through camp after camp. Some women scratched constantly. Others tried not to. But there was no escape. The itching had become part of daily life. Part of survival. As the ship finally touched the dock, a deep metallic sound echoed through the harbor. The journey was over. Or so they thought. An American officer stepped forward. His voice carried across the deck. Sharp. Clear. Authoritative. The women immediately stiffened. Every conversation stopped. Every movement froze. This was it. The moment they had feared. Orders would be given. Perhaps punishment. Perhaps interrogation. Perhaps something worse. The officer glanced at the group. Then he spoke. Line up outside. For a moment, nobody moved. The words seemed almost too simple. Too ordinary. The women exchanged nervous looks. Line up outside. What did that mean? Why were they being gathered? What awaited them on the dock? Fear spread instantly. Some imagined medical inspections. Others imagined public humiliation. A few feared execution. After everything they had witnessed during the war, none of those possibilities seemed impossible. Slowly, they obeyed. One by one, they stepped onto American soil. Cold air hit their faces. The harbor smelled different. Cleaner somehow. They formed a line exactly as ordered. No one spoke. No one smiled. The women stood shoulder to shoulder, waiting. Minutes passed. Nothing happened. No shouting. No beatings. No insults. Just silence. And somehow, that silence felt even more frightening. Then trucks appeared. Large military trucks. Several of them. The women watched as American soldiers unloaded boxes. Metal containers. Bundles of supplies. No explanation was offered. The mystery only deepened. One prisoner later recalled that she was convinced they were preparing some kind of punishment. Another remembered expecting to be searched. A third admitted she had never been more frightened than she was during those few minutes of waiting. Because uncertainty can sometimes be worse than danger itself. Finally, one American sergeant stepped forward. He looked at the exhausted prisoners. For a moment, no one knew what he was about to say. Then he gave another order. An order so unexpected that several women thought they had misunderstood. The words seemed impossible. Impossible because they contradicted everything they believed. Everything they had been told. Everything they expected from the enemy. For a few seconds, nobody reacted. The women simply stared. Trying to understand. Trying to decide whether this was some kind of trick. But the Americans were completely serious. And what happened next would become one of the most unforgettable moments of their lives. Because the real surprise was not the order itself. The real surprise was what followed. An event that would challenge years of propaganda. Years of hatred. Years of fear. An event that would force these German women to see their enemies in a completely different way. But to understand why that simple order carried such power, we first need to go back. Back to Europe. Back to the final brutal months of World War II. Back to the long road that brought these 48 women across an ocean and into one of the strangest encounters of the war. The story of those 48 women did not begin in New York Harbor. It began thousands of miles away, across a continent that was falling apart. By early 1945, Germany was collapsing. The once powerful nation that had dominated much of Europe was now fighting for survival. Cities burned day and night. Railway stations were crowded with refugees. Roads were packed with soldiers moving in every direction. The sound of artillery had become a permanent part of life. For ordinary Germans, every morning brought new uncertainty. Would their town still be standing tomorrow? Would there be food? Would there be news from loved ones? Or would another bomb fall from the sky? Among the millions caught in the chaos were young women serving in military support roles. Some worked as radio operators. Some handled communications. Others served as clerks, drivers, or administrative personnel. Many had never expected to be near a battlefield. Yet as the war entered its final months, the front lines moved rapidly. And suddenly there was no safe place left. One former prisoner later remembered hearing artillery for the first time. The sound terrified her. Not because it was loud, but because it never seemed to stop. Day after day. Night after night. The ground shook constantly. Windows rattled. People jumped at every distant explosion. Everyone knew the war was ending. But nobody knew how. Or when. Then came the captures. American forces advanced across Western Europe at incredible speed. Town after town surrendered. Thousands of German soldiers laid down their weapons. And among them were women. Many expected immediate punishment. After years of Nazi propaganda, they had been taught that enemy forces would show no mercy. The stories varied. Some claimed prisoners would be beaten. Others claimed they would disappear forever. Fear spread faster than facts. When American troops finally arrived, many prisoners prepared themselves for the worst. Instead, something unexpected happened. The Americans simply collected their weapons, recorded their names, and moved them into temporary holding areas. There were strict rules. There was discipline. But there was no revenge. At first, many prisoners could hardly believe it. One woman later admitted she spent weeks expecting the Americans to suddenly change. She believed kindness was only temporary. She was certain something terrible would happen eventually. But it never did. Still, life inside the camps remained difficult. Very difficult. Food was limited. Housing was crowded. Resources were stretched thin. The war was creating millions of prisoners faster than anyone could process them. Conditions varied from camp to camp. Some were relatively organized. Others struggled under enormous pressure. The women slept close together. Sometimes on simple cots. Sometimes on straw-filled mattresses. Sometimes wherever space could be found. Winter brought additional misery. Cold winds swept through buildings. Blankets were scarce. Many prisoners wore the same clothes for months. And that created another problem. A problem that seemed small compared to bombs and bullets. Yet became one of the greatest daily hardships. Lice. They spread everywhere. In uniforms. In blankets. In sleeping quarters. Once they appeared, eliminating them became almost impossible. The itching was relentless. Prisoners scratched until their skin became raw. Sleep became difficult. Concentration became impossible. The infestation spread from person to person. Month after month. The women learned to live with it. But living with it came at a cost. Personal dignity slowly disappeared. Looking in a mirror became painful. Many felt they no longer resembled themselves. The war had taken so much already. Now even basic cleanliness felt like a distant memory. Yet something even stranger was about to happen. In early 1945, American authorities made an unusual decision. A small group of German women would be transferred overseas. Their destination was not another camp in Europe. Their destination was America itself. The announcement spread quickly. Nobody knew what to expect. America existed mostly as an idea. A distant place. A powerful enemy. A country known through rumors and propaganda. Some prisoners imagined giant cities. Others imagined harsh prisons. Most imagined uncertainty. As preparations began, emotions mixed together. Fear, curiosity, exhaustion, hope. The women boarded a transport ship under heavy security. The Atlantic crossing was long. The ocean seemed endless. Gray waves stretched toward every horizon. Days blended together. The ship rolled constantly. Cold winds swept across the decks. Meals were simple. Sleep was difficult. And all the while, nobody knew what awaited them at the end. One former prisoner later described the journey as emotional limbo. The war seemed far away. Yet its consequences surrounded them. Every passenger aboard carried memories. Destroyed cities. Lost family members. Friends who never returned. Dreams that had vanished forever. The ocean offered time to think. Perhaps too much time. Many wondered whether they would ever see Germany again. Others worried about parents and siblings trapped inside a collapsing nation. Letters rarely arrived. Reliable information barely existed. Every day felt uncertain. Then, after weeks at sea, America finally appeared on the horizon. The Statue of Liberty emerged through morning mist. Several women stared silently. Others looked away. The sight carried complicated emotions. Relief, fear, confusion. For years they had been taught to view America as an enemy. Now America was their destination. And perhaps their future. Nobody knew. As the ship entered New York Harbor, nervous tension spread through the group. The closer they came to shore, the stronger the fear became. Questions filled every mind. Would they be imprisoned indefinitely? Would they face public humiliation? Would Americans treat them with hatred? The answers were only minutes away. Then came the order. Line up outside. The command echoed across the deck. Every woman obeyed. Their hearts raced. Many believed a difficult experience was about to begin. They could not have been more wrong. The trucks unloaded their cargo. Large metal containers. Bundles. Supplies. American soldiers moved with calm efficiency. Then came another order. This time the meaning became clear. The women were not being prepared for punishment. They were being prepared for something entirely different. Showers. Hot showers. For a moment, several prisoners simply stared. After months and, for some, more than a year without proper bathing facilities, the idea felt almost unreal. Warm water. Clean clothing. Basic hygiene. It sounded too good to be true. Many suspected a misunderstanding. Others feared disappointment. Yet American personnel continued preparing the facilities. Fresh soap appeared. Towels appeared. Medical supplies appeared. The women looked at one another in disbelief. No one had expected this. Not here. Not now. Not from the enemy. And the surprises were only beginning. Part 2. Main story, continued. For several moments, nobody moved. The women stood frozen in place. The cold harbor wind tugged at their worn uniforms while American soldiers continued arranging supplies around them. Everything felt wrong. Not dangerous. Not threatening. Just wrong. This was not how they expected the enemy to behave. For years they had been told a very different story. Yet the evidence stood directly in front of them. Soap. Towels. Medical staff. Hot water. One by one, the women were directed toward temporary washing facilities that had been prepared near the docks. Steam drifted into the cold morning air. The sight alone was almost enough to make some of them cry. Many had forgotten what real comfort looked like. Forgotten what normal life felt like. Forgotten simple things most people never think about. Clean hair. Warm water. Fresh clothing. Privacy. Dignity. One former prisoner later recalled that the smell of soap affected her more than anything else. Not because it was extraordinary, but because it reminded her of home. Of ordinary days before the war. Of a life that seemed to belong to someone else. As the first women entered the shower area, nervous tension remained. Years of war had taught them to expect hidden dangers. Even kindness could feel suspicious. Some waited for insults. Others waited for humiliation. Nothing happened. The American personnel simply did their jobs. Efficiently. Professionally. Without cruelty. Without mockery. Without revenge. Then the water began to flow. Hot water. Real hot water. For a few seconds, some women simply stood beneath it in silence. Unable to believe it was real. The warmth washed away months of dirt. Months of exhaustion. Months of misery. Many closed their eyes. Others cried quietly. Nobody spoke much. Words seemed unnecessary. The sound of running water filled the room. For the first time in a very long while, the women felt human again. Doctors and medical staff also began treating the lice infestation. The process was thorough. Clothing was collected. Equipment was disinfected. Hair treatments were provided. Medical examinations were conducted. The goal was simple. Remove the infestation completely. The women had dreamed about such a moment for months. Some for more than a year. Now it was finally happening. And yet another surprise awaited them. Fresh clothing. Clean garments. Not luxurious. Not fashionable. Just clean. Many prisoners stared at the folded clothes in disbelief. Several later admitted they could not remember the last time they had worn something that smelled fresh. The experience felt almost unreal. As if they had stepped into another world. Outside, the harbor remained busy. Ships moved through the water. Workers carried supplies. Military vehicles came and went. Life continued normally. But for the 48 women, something important had changed. A wall had begun to crack. A wall built from years of propaganda. Years of fear. Years of hatred. The enemy they expected to encounter did not match the people standing before them. That realization was difficult. Almost uncomfortable. Because accepting it meant questioning everything they had been told. And questioning deeply held beliefs is never easy. Especially after a war. In the days that followed, the women were transported to a prisoner of war facility in the United States. The journey itself became another revelation. As trains moved across America, many prisoners stared through the windows in amazement. The landscape seemed endless. Cities appeared prosperous. Farms stretched toward distant horizons. Factories operated at full capacity. Railroads carried enormous amounts of cargo. Compared to the destruction spreading across Germany, the contrast was shocking. Entire German cities had been reduced to rubble. Food shortages had become common. Transportation systems struggled to function. Yet here, thousands of miles away, life appeared remarkably stable. The women discussed it quietly among themselves. Some refused to believe what they were seeing. Others wondered whether the scenes had been carefully staged. But the evidence remained impossible to ignore. America had escaped the devastation consuming Europe. And the difference showed everywhere. At the camp, daily life followed strict routines. There were rules, schedules, responsibilities, security measures. The women remained prisoners. That fact never changed. Yet conditions often exceeded their expectations. Meals arrived regularly. Medical care was available. Living quarters were maintained. For individuals who had spent months surrounded by uncertainty, these things mattered. A great deal. One woman later recalled receiving a piece of fresh bread shortly after arriving. The memory stayed with her for decades. Not because the bread itself was remarkable, but because of what it represented. Stability. Normality. The possibility that life could improve. As weeks passed, interactions with American guards increased. At first, conversations remained limited. Both sides were cautious. The war was still ongoing. Memories remained fresh. Trust was rare. But small moments slowly changed perceptions. A guard helping carry supplies. A medic assisting a sick prisoner. A brief conversation about family. A shared joke despite language barriers. Tiny interactions. Almost insignificant by themselves. Yet together they created something powerful. Human connection. The women began discovering that many American soldiers were not very different from themselves. Most wanted the war to end. Most missed their families. Most dreamed of returning home. The realization felt strange. For years, both sides had viewed each other as enemies. Now they were discovering common ground. Not friendship. Not immediately. But understanding. And understanding often begins with small moments. Meanwhile, events in Europe continued moving rapidly. News arrived regularly. German cities continued falling. Allied armies pushed deeper into the country. The Third Reich was collapsing. Everyone knew the end was near. Then, in May 1945, the news finally arrived. Germany had surrendered. The war in Europe was over. The announcement spread throughout the camp within hours. Reactions varied. Some prisoners cried. Others sat silently. Many simply stared into space. The emotions were complicated. Relief mixed with grief. Hope mixed with uncertainty. For millions of people, the war had ended. But the future remained unknown. What would happen next? Would they return home? What would they find there? Would their families still be alive? Would their towns still exist? Nobody had answers. The questions lingered for months. Yet even as uncertainty remained, the women never forgot that morning in New York Harbor. The morning they stepped onto American soil expecting punishment. The morning they prepared themselves for humiliation. The morning an American officer ordered them to line up outside. What followed challenged everything they believed. Not because it erased the horrors of war. Nothing could do that. Not because it turned enemies into friends overnight. History is more complicated than that. But because it revealed something many people forget during conflict. Even in war, humanity can survive. Even between enemies. Even after years of hatred. And for those 48 women, that lesson would remain with them long after the guns of World War II finally fell silent. The war was over. But for the 48 German women, the journey was far from finished. Germany's surrender in May 1945 brought an end to the fighting. The guns fell silent. The bombs stopped falling. The armies stopped advancing. Across Europe, millions celebrated. Yet for countless prisoners of war, peace arrived with uncertainty. The women who had stepped onto American soil months earlier now faced a difficult question. What came next? Their homeland no longer resembled the country they remembered. Entire cities had been destroyed. Families had been separated. Governments had collapsed. Borders were changing. The Germany they left behind no longer existed. Months passed before many prisoners were finally repatriated. During that time, life inside the camps gradually changed. The atmosphere became less tense. More information arrived from Europe. Letters began reaching prisoners. Sometimes they brought relief. Sometimes heartbreak. One woman learned that her parents had survived the war. Another discovered that her hometown had been heavily damaged. Others received no news at all. The silence was often the hardest part. Many spent long evenings staring into the darkness, wondering what awaited them across the Atlantic. Would anyone be there to greet them? Would they even recognize the streets where they grew up? Nobody knew. Then, one by one, transport arrangements began. The women who had arrived in America as frightened prisoners prepared for another voyage. This time the emotions felt different. Fear had not disappeared completely. But it had changed. The enemy they once imagined no longer seemed so simple. Months of experience had complicated the picture. Reality often does. War divides people into sides. Good and evil. Us and them. Friend and enemy. Married. Some raised families. Some rarely spoke about the war. Others shared their experiences only late in life. Many carried painful memories. Like countless people of their generation, they learned to live alongside those memories rather than escape them. Yet among those memories remained an unexpected chapter. A chapter that contradicted everything they thought they knew. Historians often focus on battles, generals, weapons, military strategies. And those things matter. But history is also built from smaller moments. Moments that never appear on maps. Moments that do not change front lines. Moments involving ordinary people making ordinary choices. The story of these women belongs to that kind of history. A story hidden beneath larger events. A reminder that war is ultimately experienced by human beings. Not statistics. Not headlines. Not numbers. People. People who become frightened. People who become exhausted. People who suffer. People who hope. And sometimes, people who surprise one another. The Second World War remains one of the most devastating conflicts in human history. More than 60 million lives were lost. Entire nations were transformed forever. The scars remain visible even today. Yet within that enormous tragedy are countless forgotten stories. Stories that reveal something important about human nature. This is one of them. Because when the women stepped off that ship, they believed they understood who their enemies were. By the time they left America, that certainty had disappeared. Reality had proven more complicated. More human. More unexpected. Perhaps that is the greatest lesson hidden within this story. War encourages people to see each other as symbols. As uniforms. As enemies. But real life is rarely that simple. The women had expected cruelty. Instead, they encountered professionalism. They expected humiliation. Instead, they received dignity. They expected punishment. Instead, they found something they never imagined. Humanity. That did not erase the suffering of the war. It did not erase the destruction across Europe. It did not erase the millions who never came home. But it left an impression. A memory. A reminder that individuals can make choices even during history's darkest moments. Years later, several former prisoners would still remember that day in New York Harbor. Not because it changed the outcome of the war. Not because it altered world history. But because of what it revealed. A simple order. Line up outside. At the time, those words sounded terrifying. The women expected the worst. Instead, they were given something they desperately needed. Cleanliness. Medical care. Basic dignity. For people who had endured 18 months without proper washing facilities, the experience became unforgettable. What made the moment powerful was its simplicity. No grand speeches. No dramatic ceremonies. No political declarations. Just ordinary human decency. And sometimes that is what people remember most. The years after the war brought enormous challenges. Germany faced reconstruction on a scale almost impossible to imagine. Cities had to be rebuilt. Roads repaired. Families reunited. Entire communities started over from nothing. Millions struggled to create normal lives again. The former prisoners became part of that process. Some as strangers. But beneath every uniform stands a human being. And sometimes, even in the middle of history's darkest chapters, humanity finds a way to survive. A hot shower. A clean towel. A small act of dignity. These things may seem insignificant compared to the scale of a world war. Yet for 48 exhausted women standing in New York Harbor in 1945, they meant everything. Because after 18 months of hardship, someone chose compassion instead of humiliation. Respect instead of revenge. Humanity instead of hatred. And decades later, that is what remained. Not the fear. Not the propaganda. Not the rumors. But the memory of an unexpected kindness during one of the darkest periods in human history. If you enjoyed this hidden World War II story, please like, subscribe, and join us for more forgotten stories from history.